back to your class in Applied International Economic Policy. This is our ninth topic of the course, the penultimate topic on public debt. The question we'll be concerned with today is essentially, well, how much is too much? In a lot of the lectures before this week, many of the policy recommendations involved increased government spending. So the frequent criticism of such a policy response is, well, we simply cannot afford it without triggering some runaway explosive process of public debt, or it's too much for future generations to bear, and so on. So we're going to consider some of those considerations in today's lecture. Okay, so the lecture consists of a few points. First, we'll look at the data on the matter. We'll look at then some of the theory. So what is called sound finance versus a functional finance approach. I think it's fair to say the sound finance approach is at the heart of the mainstream contributions or more orthodox contributions, and functional is certainly more of a heterodox tradition or post-Keynesian tradition. So we'll go over that theory in order to try and help kind of form our own opinion on what is a sustainable level of debt taken out by national governments. After we summarize our findings, we'll then briefly talk about corona bonds, as they have obviously become quite pertinent in the last few weeks. Okay, so here are some headlines from some newspapers that I just pulled from the web, and it just shows that, especially after the financial crisis, there was this new wave or new push for new kinds of debt limits in national laws, or at least it just reflected a concern for the high levels of public debt to GDP. So not only Merkel was pushing for debt break laws at the European level, as we see here. Oh, sorry, that should say 2011 actually. That was in 2011, when debts of the Eurozone members was around 74% of collective GDP. John Boehner in the United States was arguing that it is a moral threat to the US to have a level of debt which was around 67% of GDP at the time in 2011. And even a few years later, quite a few years later, after the financial crisis of 2007-2008, we saw George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, or the sort of Minister for Finance, if you like, in the UK, was arguing that further austerity measures were needed in order to reduce government spending and reduce the amount of new debt issued by the British government at the time, even though this was a few years later. Okay, so let's put this in context. How much public debt is out there, and who's issuing all this debts at the national level? So here we have data from the IMF for all the countries, or most of the countries around the world, and we can see that in 2015 the most indebted countries were Japan, US, Italy, and Portugal perhaps. And we see that a lot of the European nations had a debt to GDP ratio between 65 and 100%, as did other countries like India and Brazil and so on. Okay, but let's go into a bit more longitudinal data. Here we have public debts expressed as a percentage of GDP between 1950 and 2015, again data from the IMF. And what we see is that in the G20 advanced group of economies, we have quite a clear upward trend in the data, whereas among the emerging economies, it trended upward somewhat, but that hasn't continued since in the last decade or 2 decades as much. So from this perspective alone, it seems like, wow, okay, the G20, the more advanced economies seem to be taking out or issuing amount of debt, which seems historically very high. Fortunately, however, the IMF have data going back much longer, back to 1800 in fact. And what we see is among the more advanced economies, this more recent higher level of debt to GDP as an average across those economies is historically not the peak as it would appear in our first slide there. In fact, it's not the historical maximum at all. Of course, as we would expect in times of war, debt to GDP goes up quite a lot. And this has become relevant in recent months as the coronavirus crisis has made politicians compare our current predicament and pandemic to war in order to try and almost get the population on board with the higher level of debt. And this is what we can see in the historical data. In times of war, debt to GDP skyrockets. If we look at a more a finer view by selecting some countries in particular rather than averages across the G20 and so on, let's see how trends in the debt to GDP ratio have changed over the last 200 years or so. So here in red we have the United Kingdom, and as we see around towards the end of World War II, there is a debt to GDP above 250%. And in, what do we have here? So this is Greece. Already at the beginning of the 20th century, it was well over 200%. So even for Greece, it's not only in recent years that it's peaked historically. And yeah, we have the Netherlands and Germany, although Netherlands here clearly quite high historically in the past, but not really, and recent years pale in comparison. If we look at some major Asian economies, we don't have as much data on China, India, and South Korea, but Japan we have data going back to 1875. Interestingly, Japan, one of the most indebted countries in the world as of today, yeah, this is the historical peak. This is still one of the highest in Japan's history. It is the highest level of public debts that it's ever experienced, at war times included, which is quite a fascinating example given that Japan, by many measures, is considered a stable and successful modern capitalistic economy, but yet it has a level of debt to GDP which is many times more than what we see in, say, the US or the Euro area and so on. So we're going to be kind of coming back to why that can be, or how can a country have such a high level of public debt and still not be collapsing. Same thing for North American countries. Again, we have data on the US back to 1800. Canada and Mexico is a bit more recent. And for these economies, we see that again around wartime, we see this peak in Canada and US. And for the US, it really is approaching in recent years, approaching its historical high in terms of debt to GDP, which is relatively low compared to Japan and the UK and so on. And lastly, oh no, not lastly, second to last, excuse me, we have the South American economies, which are show much more sort of erratic behavior over time, depending on the exact source of the new issue of public debt. And in Africa, we see for those countries that we have data, generally there has been quite a high level of public debt around the 1990s, and we had the emerging market debt crisis around that time that affected South American economies too. So we see the peak, or yeah, some of the peaks in around that time. Okay, so a lot of the concern with public debt has led, since the financial crisis and before, in fact, to the adoption and promotion of so-called balanced budget rules, whereby a country's government essentially says, we're going to tie our own hands. We're going to ensure that we do not spend more than we earn, or at least adjusted over the whole business cycle, from trough to trough or peak to peak in the business cycle. we are not going to spend more than we take in taxes. So you might still have a deficit, but this is literally just for tying you over to the next period, rather than the idea of sort of borrowing to invest, or whatever the case may be. So just a little history on these balanced budget rules. One of the first was Switzerland, 2003, no structural deficit allowed. So when we say structural deficit, that is the deficit adjusted for the business cycle. Of course, we would expect with the business cycle, the deficit would increase during a recession, as you have these automatic stabilizers and so on that kick in when, say, more people apply for unemployment benefits. And sort of similar automatic pre-approved legislation that has been passed in the past basically necessarily implies that the deficit will increase in a recession. At the same time, you would expect, well, if the economy is booming, then perhaps there'll be more of a tax revenue intake during the expansion, and so that's why the sort of key thing to look at in some sense is the structural deficit when we consider these balanced budget rules. Okay, France 2008 passed similar legislation with the objective of balancing public sector accounts. 2009, the Schuldenbremse in Germany. This is the basis of the reading for this week, or for Thursday. So we're going to get into a lot more detail on this. But as you will see, if you didn't know already, essentially the Schuldenbremse was a constitutional amendment, so it's in the Grundgesetz, outlawing structural deficits at federal levels greater than 0.35%. So it's not wiping out the structural deficit altogether, but it's essentially doing so, because that is quite low, very low in fact. And so that's for the Bund, for Germany as a whole. Whereas for the Länder, the Bundesländer, the states of Germany, structural deficits are meant to be wiped out completely. I can't quite remember the dates by which it was meant to happen. I think it was by 2020, the structural deficit was meant to be wiped out for the Länder, and maybe by 2016, I think it was for Germany. But we'll get into the details with this week's reading. Spain and Italy passed similar laws. In Spain, the law was to say that public debt cannot exceed 60% of GDP from 2020. And in Italy, the deficits were outlawed as the sort of default position. So in many countries, we see this move towards policymakers actively seeking to tie their own hands, which is a sort of strange phenomenon if you don't know too much about economic theory. Why would a policymaker want to take away power from itself in some sense? We'll get into that. These are not the only countries, as we've also seen similar measures in Poland, Slovenia, a number of US states, and in the UK as well. Interestingly, we've seen this in economies larger than just a nation state. So across the EU, we've had acts that have been passed, like Stability and Growth Acts, the Fiscal Compact, among others, which have implied rules for the deficits of the member nations of the EU. So we see there's a general budget deficit that limits the deficit to the rule limits the deficit to 3% of GDP. The structural deficit to 0.5% of GDP if the debt to GDP ratio is greater than 60%. If it's less than 60% overall, then the deficit, how much more you spend than you take in taxes, should be less than 1% of GDP. So there's more flexibility if your debt to GDP ratio is sufficiently low under these rules. And on top of that, depending on how your public debt to GDP ratio, how it stands, there are rules then for how fast the member states should adjust. So how fast it should change its public debt to GDP ratio, depending on the level. And on top of that, then there are economic sanctions, or the possibility at least, an emphasis on the possibility, if the targets are not met. Okay, so we see all these rules, we see the historical data, and the recent rise of sort of policymakers complaining about public debt in the media. So the question is why? Why care about public debt? What are the arguments against a high level of public debt? So there are three kind of steps I'd like to take on the exploration of the more orthodox arguments. And they almost go in a kind of chronological fashion in terms of when they were first proposed, although the first two kind of go together. But the third one is more of a recent argument against public debt. The emphasis is sound finance, not functional finance. So we're going to see what those terms mean. But in a nutshell, the idea of sound finance is, well, keep your house in order, ensure that your outgoings are not higher than your income, or not much higher. Whereas functional finance is, well, you need to use your financing options, so debt, essentially, to push the ability to create or generate new income. So the debt that you take on serves a function of creating income that you can use for paying back the debts and other purposes. Okay, so crowding out is perhaps one of the most cited reasons to be concerned about public investment and public debts, and it's one of the most long-standing as well. This goes back to even classical thought. And it is very much related to the loanable funds theory that we approached and discussed in, what week was it? I think it was the week on secular stagnation. It would have been, yeah. So we already have the framework in mind. Here on the x-axis we have loanable funds, the quantity of loanable funds, and on the y-axis we have the interest rates. This upward sloping curve is the supply of loanable funds, which is another way of saying the total amount of saving going on, and the notional amount of saving that would go on for every interest rate that could be offered or could be met in equilibrium. And then the investment curve shows the demand for loanable funds. Those firms that want to make use of the funds that are available for investment purposes. Okay, so the central idea of crowding out is that, well, public investment supposedly crowds out private investment. So for every euro the German government spends, the fear is that somehow takes away funds that could have been used by private investors for their own purposes for investment. Okay, so we don't need to go into the mechanism of how the loanable funds theory works because we've done that already. But we know that the interest rate, the equilibrium or natural interest rate, is determined by the interaction of these supply and demand curves for loanable funds. So now let's try to consider what happens, or how we can explain crowding out using this framework. Well, the deficit here called D is defined as, well, the difference between government expenditure and taxation. If G is greater than T, then we have a deficit equal to the difference between the two. If we have T greater than G, then we have a negative deficit or a surplus. So now, for the purposes of the illustration, if you like, let's suppose that government expenditure is completely financed through government bonds, right? So that is to say that D is equal to G, right? Because there's no taxation. Yep. Now recall that you have equilibrium when your savings and taxes, or the total amount of saving and taxes, equal to investment plus government expenditure. You can think of this as the equilibrium that occurs when you have, say, your consumption and your saving and your taxes. So what you can do with the money that comes in, so your income, right? You can either consume it, which isn't written here, but you'll see why in a second. You can either consume it, so you can save it, or it can be taken away from you in the form of taxes. So that's the income that comes in. And then the expenditure that goes out, well, you've got consumption, again, not written here. It could be investments, or it could be in the form of governments. So these are the sort of the leakages, as we discussed, and here are the injections back into the monetary system. So that is our definition of when we have our equilibrium in a monetary capitalistic system. So let's see what happens if we're at our equilibrium. Well, according to the classical theory, saving is a function of the interest rates. Investment is a function of the interest rates, and G is just, well, that's determined by policymakers. So what happens then if policymakers increase their government spending? In the framework of loanable funds, we can see it as a rightward shift of the investment curve, or the demand for loanable funds curve. So as G shifts out, what we see is that now we have a new intersection of the demand and supply curves here at this point here. But at this point, we'll have a higher interest rate, of course, right? Because we're in an exogenous money system. No money is created by central banks, essentially. There's no endogenous money. So that money that is used by the governments is, by the way this theory is constructed, taken away from private investors, or is no longer available to private investors. So that means the interest rate goes up because capital becomes more scarce. And so we see a shrinkage of the amount of private investment. So at this interest rate, we see the investment, the private investment goes to here, right? So in the end, we end up shrinking private investment by this much. So the effects, the interest rate rises from I0 to I1. Saving increases, right, as we see, well, from our new equilibrium here, because remember, at each equilibrium, saving is equal to investment, so we could equally write S1, for example. And consumption decreases at the new higher interest rates. The total borrowing increases, investment one, so this is private investment plus government expenditure, is greater than I0, but the private investment is crowded out because, as we saw, the private investment goes from I0 to I1, right? So we have, we don't manage to stimulate the economy because that increase in government expenditure is met by a decrease of equivalent size of private investments. So in that sense, public investment is just considered to be ineffective, essentially. Okay, this leads or is related to another fundamental idea in economics, that of Ricardian equivalence. Basic statements of what Ricardian equivalence is, named after David Ricardo, of course, one of the most prominent classical economists, is that government borrowing is simply a form of deferred taxation. So this means that if the government borrows now in order to spend and boost the economy, then it must tax later in order to pay back that debt. So let's kind of go through what that means. First, it must be emphasized that within this sort of theory, we have a stark and strong assumption, which is that agents have perfect rationality and information. They can foresee the future and are rational enough to kind of comprehend everything that's going on in the economy and what the government is doing. So this is the sort of line of causation, if you like. You have an increased amount of public debt. Therefore, taxpayers who are perfectly rational and have full information of this increase in government spending over taxation, taxpayers now expect that they must pay higher taxes in the future in order to pay off that debt. Knowing this, taxpayers then, as rational as they are, save any additional income from increased government expenditure to pay for future higher taxes, because they know that they're going to be taxed more in the future. This increase in saving means lower consumption. So again, we arrive at the conclusion, albeit through slightly different means compared to the crowding out argument, which is now that government spending is ineffective, whether funded through taxation or through borrowing, because agents are fully rational and counteract any increase in government expenditure with decreased consumption. because they are saving in order to pay the future tax bill, right? So it's a kind of, it's a fundamental idea in economics. It can seem a little bit funny to think that individuals start saving more when they hear that the government is spending more. But this is simply a reflection of the strong assumption that we have made about perfect rationality and full information. But it also kind of presupposes that the debt level, we'll get into a bit more detail on this, but it presupposes that the debt to GDP ratio won't be sustainable at a higher level later on, so that it can't simply be funded by future deficits as well. So it also implicitly depends on the assumptions the agents have about what is a sustainable level of public debt to GDP. So, problems with these arguments? Well, one should be very clear to you already, namely that money is not exogenous. So this idea of a loanable funds markets, where there's a set quantity of loanable funds and so on, just is not the way the monetary system in modern capitalistic economies works. And we've had plenty of support to prove this from central bankers themselves, as we got into in the past. Yeah, and clearly you can argue, well, people are simply not so perfectly rational, nor perfectly informed, nor necessarily share the view that the debt to GDP ratio will be unstable at a slightly higher level or higher level. I initially made these slides and meant to deliver them at the beginning of the course, but I moved the content around, so that's why I do have a few slides on explaining the fact that money is not exogenous. But of course, since we have done that before, I'll skim through these a bit quicker. But let me at least read out this quote and explain this schematic I have here. So the quote is from Mark Leroy, who summarizes it quite neatly. Banks create loans and deposits ex nihilo. I think I used this quote before as well. So out of nothing, right? Ex nihilo, out of nothing. So causality is reversed. It is not the deposits of the economic agents that allow banks to make more credits. It is the decisions of banks to grant more credits that leads to the creation of money deposits. So investment determines savings, not saving determining investments. Let's put this in a sort of schematic that we have here. So let's see. Here we have kind of what Leroy was talking about here. Credit is granted by banks that is used for investments. And that investment then goes to, the company in whom you are investing, or the firm in whom you're investing. It goes to deposits at their commercial banks. Okay? But then you could ask, well, what determines the amount of credit that is granted by commercial banks? Well, there's two main things that you can look at. First is the credit worthiness standards. What are the standards for the amount of credit that can be created in commercial banks? And of course, this will depend largely on rules within those commercial banks, their own risk models, their own regulations, self-regulations, and perceptions of risk, right? But it will also depend greatly on government's regulation, so external regulation, rules imposed top-down. On the other side, well, you must ask, rather than the supply of credits, the demand for credit, what determines the demand for credits? And of course, from a Keynesian perspective, the demand for credit is very hard to explain without reference to some simple idea of psychology or mass psychology, some general level or state of confidence, what is famously known as animal spirits. You can say, well, there are other things that determine the demand for credit, especially, well, how well the economy is doing overall. If you're at full capacity, outputs and employment, then perhaps the state of confidence is tied to the overall perception of how well the economy is doing. And if other people are doing well, if the economy is doing well overall, then perhaps your confidence to go out and ask for a loan will be improved, right? So we see these various factors come together to determine how credit is granted, that credit is used for investment, which leads to savings, right? Okay, I won't go into these quotes because we probably even went through them in the lecture on secular stagnation. So now we arrive at our third theory as to why. Where was it? Yeah, why from a mainstream perspective, a high level of public debt is either ineffective or undesirable. And this is has been kind of nicknamed the confidence fairy by Paul Krugman in the years after the financial crisis. And we'll see why now. So this is not relying necessarily on exogenous money ideas, but it nonetheless comes to the same conclusion that public debt to GDP should be kept at a certain level. So even if money, from this perspective, this sort of new classical or new consensus perspective, the idea is that even if money is truly endogenous, some economists argue that high public debt leads to a loss of business confidence, which lowers private investment. This is reflected largely in the writings and speeches of Jean-Claude Trichet, who was president of the ECB at the time of the financial crisis, who said that the idea of austerity measures could trigger stagnation is incorrect. It's the opposite. Confidence-inspiring policies will foster and not hamper economic recovery. So here we have it. The idea is if you reduce the amounts of government spending and keep your house in order, as the phrase often goes, then this will inspire confidence in the financial markets and lead to more credit that is created. So using our schematic again, we're now saying that the state of confidence is actually dependent upon, austerity on public spending not being too high, public debt not being too high. Now, you could argue, and so I should also mention Alessina and a few from the Italian Bocconi school have popularized this approach after the financial crisis. These kind of more new classical guys. So the question really is, how could austerity lead to improved state of confidence in investors, in those or on entrepreneurs? The idea is quite hard to pin down and to justify. I mean, perhaps for those in the Italian Bocconi school, they'll find it easier, but I find it particularly hard. But from my reading, the idea is simply something like, if there is not too high a public debt to GDP ratio, then investors believe that the economy is well managed, that it's not going to fall into high inflation or hyperinflation with too much debt. Or if the public debt is too high, then perhaps it would mean that there's too much government spending going on, and that could mean less opportunities for private investors. But quite frankly, there's just not a very solid theory as to why so-called expansionary fiscal contraction would lead to a higher state of confidence. And by expansionary fiscal contraction, this is a purely hypothetical expression, as in austerity will lead to expansion because somehow state of confidence means there's more private investment taking place. But really, the way to look at this newest argument, which gets around the exogenous money critique, is to see it as a kind of a child in intellectual terms of the ideas of the classicals. So it really reflects the crowding out kind of mentality, but does so in a more somewhat more acceptable monetary conception of money. So where money can be endogenous, but really it's kind of a hangover from the past. In terms of economic ideas. So let's return to Paul Krugman, who did popularize the confidence fairy arguments. I think perhaps this is the article or blog post on his New York Times page where he came up with it, or perhaps it was maybe a year after. It was around the time he first kind of popularized it anyway. when he said, "So the next time you hear serious-sounding people explaining the need for fiscal austerity, try to parse their arguments. Almost surely you'll discover what sounds like hard-headed realism actually rests on a foundation of fantasy, on the belief that invisible vigilantes will punish us if we're bad, and the confidence fairy will reward us if we're good." So here he's kind of pointing out this strange and extremely unclear link between austerity, reducing public debt, and improving confidence. Stiglitz also referred to it in a piece of the same year. Advocates of austerity believe that mystically, as the deficits come down, confidence in the economy will be restored and investment will boom. For 75 years, there has been a contest between this theory and Keynesian theory, which argued that spending more now, especially on public investment or tax cuts designed to encourage private investment, was more likely to restore growth, even though it increased the deficit. So this is the Keynesian idea, right? You increase the deficit in order to invest in projects that employ people who then pay taxes, or create more outputs because they are efficient public investment and so on. So this is the Keynesian idea. The two prescriptions could not have been more different. Thanks to the IMF, multiple experiments have been conducted, for example, in East Asia at the end of the 90s and a little later in Argentina, and almost all come to the same conclusion. The Keynesian prescription works. Austerity converts downturns into recessions and recessions into depressions. The confidence fairy that the austerity advocates claim will appear never does. Okay, so we have a real clear difference in economic theory. The classically minded economists push the idea that we have seen here, and the Keynesian economists say, well, no, you need to invest, you need to spend in order to tax. You don't tax in order to spend, you spend in order to tax. So, let us perhaps take a short pause here, and when we come back in the next video, we will continue with the post-Keynesian idea of functional finance, and we'll start with Kalecki. So see you in the next video.